Have you ever found yourself in the middle of a crowd only to be consumed by a profound sense of loneliness? It's a paradoxical emotion that resonates with many of us, that yearning for connection amidst a sea of people. Well, in our contemporary world, loneliness has evolved into an epidemic that transcends cultural boundaries. Yet amidst this prevailing sense of isolation, it's essential to remember the truth. This isn't the way it's meant to be. You were purposely designed for companionship, for forging connections that hold deep meaning in the very core of your being. Well, today's guest is a passionate advocate for this very notion. Justin Whitmel Earley, an accomplished author, speaker, and lawyer, has channeled his passion into a profound exploration. His latest work, Made for People, delves into the transformative power of friendship, offering valuable strategies to confront the shadow of loneliness. Justin, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Meg. I'm honored by your introduction and really excited to talk.
You know, you're really hitting the nail on the head with this topic. I think it's something that we all feel, particularly in this age of sort of burgeoning electronics and spending more and more time on screens, that we all experience loneliness, but people don't really want to talk about it because we feel sort of, what's wrong with us? Why do I not have many friends?
Right.
So talk about why you wrote Made for People and what got you into writing the book?
Well, two things. One, the goodness of friends in my life, and two, the crisis of the world that I see right now. And I'll go in reverse order. What you just described is hopefully becoming common knowledge of reality. So the U.S. and many Western countries are entering into serious crises of loneliness, where our Surgeon General, for example, here in the United States in 2023, has released an extensive report, everybody should go look at it, on the epidemic of loneliness and isolation in the U.S. And the shocking thing is that these are not soft, squishy problems. This is good empirical data showing that we are dying earlier because of the way that we are living relationally. For example, chronic loneliness will reduce your life expectancy to the tune of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So this is a crisis on the level of obesity or smoking in the US. But as you just said, most of us, and I'm like this, most of us wouldn't self-identify as lonely. So most of us, we might have heard studies like that and think, oh my gosh, this is a serious problem for other people out there.
Right.
Well, actually, it's not the sort of isolated recluse living in an apartment alone that makes up these statistics. It's actually people like you and me who are surrounded by other people, but feel known by none of them. And loneliness is where the American current is headed. So if you're a normal American, you are probably wrestling with loneliness. If you're a normal American, you're being pushed into a life of busier, wealthier people who used to have friends. And so I look out at this crisis and I think, my goodness, if I think about my life for just a quick moment, I realize the difference between the two versions of me, the one that is and is, persevering through hard things in life, and the one that could have been, the one that would just fall apart and collapse or become really unhealthy and addicted. The difference has been friendships. And I think that is true of so many people. The commonality we all have is that life is hard. We suffer. We will face difficult things. But if we face them alone, it's a completely different future and it's not a bright one. When we face them together with other people, everything changes. And so I thought, my goodness, I have seen the power of friendship in my life. I've got to write about this.
I was just having an interview with a gal on suicide, and particularly suicide in kids, suicide in teens. And I think that a common factor, and I haven't seen it in a study, I haven't done it, would be the sense of loneliness and isolation. Nobody gets me. Nobody feels like this. I might as well just give up. Because she said one of the answers to that is for kids to have an adult mentor, someone that they can talk to who's safe. And I think you're right on, because if you look at the way businesses are conducted or people conduct their business, that's lonely too. We sit in front of a computer 8 or 9 hours a day. And we talk to people through Zoom, but it's very different. Do you think work style has played a role in increasing the amount of loneliness we have?
Yes. And I think in two ways that you just named. I mean, first, physical style of work, i.e., when you're communicating with somebody across a technological medium, and we can actually acknowledge there are a lot of gifts here. I'm thankful for, a remote conversation where we can see each other in person, but it's very different than sitting in a room. Texting is different than talking. Messaging on social media is different than shouting at somebody from a car, and Zooming is different than being in a meeting room with somebody. And I think the dangers of these things is that it's so easy now to feel like you're connected to somebody, but you actually haven't really experienced the deep human embodied connection that you were made for and that you need. And I think the snack meal metaphor is very helpful here. So, if we just eat snacks, we know what happens. We feel full, but we're completely unnourished, and our body will encounter all sorts of problems and unhealth. Thus, we need to, go towards good meals. And snacks are okay as long as we're really eating good meals. Technology, I think, is a snack form of relationship. It's not all bad. And sometimes it tides us over to the next interaction. It's great to, FaceTime with your grandparents before you see them again at Christmas, for example. But if we're not focusing on the nourishment of embodied relationships, and this goes at work and this goes for the rest of life, then we will have a soul kind of death from the technological snack of connection. So I really encourage people to use technology for what it's good at, small little contact, but you need to figure out how to feast on the meal of relationship. And that is happening all around us in our work life. The other thing that I think is really important here is that the natural progression of a lot of work is to become more isolated. You think about, the people at the top, or as you move up, you become less vulnerable, you become less known. And lots of times you start to harbor secrets and problems, and you feel like, I can't talk to people about this because I'm leading this organization, or I'm leading this family, or what will people think of me? And one of the greatest challenges I have in this book, and the greatest hopes, is that it would encourage people at the top and people everywhere all the way down to the bottom to be people who live without secrets. Because we all need somebody who knows us really, really well and sticks around to be our friend anyway. That strength that a friend gives when they know you fully and stick around anyway is an unmeasurable confidence that you begin to face the world with. And it just comes from a simple thing called friendship.
I love it, because I remember thinking specifically 12 years ago when my mother died. I was very close with my mother. And before she died, I thought, I'm not going to make it. If my mom died, I'm not going to make it. But I knew she was going to die. And after she died, my best friend was just around. And I thought, if I just have one person with me, I can do this. I can get through today, and then I can get through tomorrow. And that was profound for me. I have great relationships with my adult kids, but just to have one person, and I thought, if you have one person with you through any kind of trial, you really can get through it. So that it really drove that home for me. Let's talk about kids a little bit.
Yes.
Kids are on screens. We know that, as the Surgeon General said, that social media is toxic for kids. It's very, very harmful for kids.
Yeah.
And then we see kids in classrooms, and we hear about bullying a lot. And so it seems there's a lot of tension in classrooms, even when the kids are very young. So what would you say to parents out there as far as parenting their young kids and their teenagers about how to develop healthy relationships?
The longer you can keep your kids away from social media and smartphone technologies, the better.
Mm-hmm.
It should be seen something more like a car. You need to be trained for it, and you need to get it when you are old enough to learn how to deal with it. But you do need to learn it in the home.
Right.
So my wife and I, for example, have tentatively committed with in our relationship and with some other families around us that we think, probably around the 10th grade is the right time
Mm-hmm.
to start. And that's going to be really hard because many people are just, even schools are handing out devices
Mm-hmm.
as if, competency on a smartphone is a requirement to, enter the 7th grade. And it's like, look, all these things are so easy to use now. You don't need to be trained.
No.
In fact, you're going to be addicted because you don't have the psychological capability, the emotional maturity, or just the coaching to go through, hey, these are really addictive.
Mm-hmm.
They're made to change your brain. So I just say, be careful, push that time horizon off. And then the other thing that I would just really, really say is to stay involved with your kids and their devices. I mean, my oldest is 11, so he doesn't have a smartphone yet, but he got a computer that's the family's computer that he's learning to type on. There are TVs in our house. And one of the things that I make sure of is that I can see the history of every program. I can see the internet history. I can see, which apps are closed down and password protected. And I talk to him and my other kids about, hey, this is not an invisible place. We can see what each other does here. And this is a way to help be transparent and say, act with integrity here, make good decisions here. And that all really boils down to being involved.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I don't want to come across as a Luddite.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a business lawyer who writes on the side. I use technology all day, every day. I just think it's a great call for us in our moment of our generation to say, I'm going to raise my kids to be people who leave the house, who know the boundaries of technology and who know how to act with integrity on it.
Yeah.
That would be an incredible gift to a generation that's actually dying because of loneliness and technological misuses.
Well, technology serves very different purposes. I think, a lot of my work is done on a screen as well. I'm not on social media personally. I mean, I'm all about the Gab phone. My listeners hear me say this all the time, the Gab phone. Because the Gab phone, when you start using it, doesn't hook up to the internet. And then there's a graduated introduction to the internet and different apps and things like that. So, I think that helps. And I think that we hopefully will see, more protection and more apps on phones that are going to protect our kids. But, the whole loneliness factor is really intriguing. And a lot of it does have to do with loneliness. Why do you think our kids, aside from technology, why do you think our kids are lonely, our junior high and high school kids?
I just went through a really, really good book called The Coddling of the American Mind. I don't know if you've ever read it, but it has some great stats on the rising generation that has just gone through college and is now going through college. And there's a lot of really interesting trends, some of which are technological, some of which are psychological, that are making the rising generation of children different. And one of them that's worth noting here is, I think, a problem of parenting, and it is an extreme aversion to risk. Some people call it safetyism.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this idea that, if my kids are going to do something, I need to be there with them, supervising them, making sure they don't get in trouble or not bullied or not hurt. And it's obviously a good impulse to protect our kids from danger, but it's also obviously a good impulse to start to push our baby birds out of the nest and let them take appropriate risks, let them get actually injured in emotionally or physically inappropriate ways, because humans psychologically are anti-fragile. Like we need things that stress our system a little bit if we're going to become resilient. And so the less, we're allowing our kids, let's say, just to go down to the neighborhood park and play with other kids, and we think, oh no, they might get kidnapped or hurt or something like that. Well, we're actually training them to avoid situations where friendship, relationship, human dynamics, like it's the playground for human dynamics. And that's how you learn to engage in relationships. And then suddenly they get to college or later high school and realize they don't know how to make friends. And so just one of the things I would say is, as parents, we need to shepherd our children into arenas where they will be practicing friendship, because friendship is not something you can just do on a dime. It's not something you can just start. It's not something that's easy, but it is something we all need, and it is something that can be practiced, and we can put our kids in situations to help them work on that.
I love it. Now I'm going to broach a very sensitive topic: children with divorced parents. Talk about the loneliness. Is the loneliness they experience different from the loneliness a child who's just home with married parents but never really sees them because they're on their device all the time?
I wouldn't claim to be an expert on this, so I'll speak with a certain amount of humility, but I do think there is a reality to consider. If you read the ACE lists of traumatic experiences of childhood, divorce is going to be on the list. So any child who has experienced a divorce is going to have some small t trauma that is they're going to need help to do relationships in a way that a child of a family who has not been divorced is not going to need help. And that doesn't have to come with judgment. I'm sure, anybody listening that says, I'm divorced, well, I don't want to be,
You're right.
There's many things that will be small t traumas for our children. And the good news is that we can help them.
Right.
But I do think you're going to have to pay particular attention, because something has happened that is probably going to make them think a relationship is particularly hard, it's particularly dangerous, you can get really hurt, and then all the other intangibles that come with that. So, it's certainly not the end of the world. And I'm a big believer in grace. And grace is the idea that yesterday doesn't have to be the same as today. You can act different. You can grow. You can change.
Right.
And then that's important here.
The reason I bring it up really is not to bring shame or guilt upon people who are divorced, but simply to say, this is one of the things that your child may struggle with. And here's the good news. If you acknowledge it, and you not acknowledge it to your child, they can get past it. And I think the sense that we don't want to acknowledge a lot of their feelings makes them feel more lonely. If you're struggling with your child and you're divorced, it doesn't mean they can't get past things, but they might be experiencing things that their friends who have married parents aren't. Now, I'm intrigued by you, Justin, because you're a lawyer and you're an author and you go around speaking. How did you get to a point in your life where you spanned all of these different professions, I'll call them?
Here's how I got here in 60 seconds. I actually was a missionary in China, working with the underground Christian church in China when I first graduated college. And then I actually felt really called to go to law school. So in like my missional language, I really felt like it was something that God wanted me to do. And so I sort of ran at it with all the fervor of a missionary on a call. And I completely assimilated to the lifestyle of a top law school. I went to Georgetown in DC, and then got accepted for a job at one of the top law firms in Virginia. So I was working in big law. And my life, right around the age of 30, completely fell apart. I actually devolved into terrible anxiety, panic attacks, insomnia. And I went from being this missionary who felt called to law to being converted to the nervous medicating lawyer who couldn't sleep unless I had pills or a drink or two. And I started to realize, how did this happen?
How'd you get here?
How did I get converted? Like I was supposed to be the missionary. I got converted by law school. As it turns out, and this was a long journey of mine, but I realized that the habits and the rhythms of the environment you live in, when you just adopt them, they have incredible power to change you mentally, spiritually, physically. And so, Dr. Meg, long story short, I started writing really as a way to process initially about habits and spiritual formation and emotional and mental health. And that was my first book. It was about habits in work life and technology life. And that quickly, because I was during that same time becoming a father of 4 boys, that became a second book called Habits of the Household, where I wrote about the same idea of habits as spiritually formative in parenting and family. And as I started to think about community life, that's where I really started to get interested in this idea of the habit of friendship, what makes or breaks the difference of people's life as they go out of the home. But you can't sum up friendship as a habit.
Right.
So it's an art as much as it is a habit. So Made for People, this book is on the art and habit of friendship. I've been a person who's started to become a very much, I live a life of habit. And one of my habits is to do an hour of writing every morning before I start my legal work at 9 a.m. So about from 8 to 9 every morning, I write. And when you do small things like that over and over every day, they actually aggregate into books. And so it's, I can still sleep 7+ hours a night and parent 4 boys.
And so did you find that forming those kind of habits really and friendships really pulled you out of that dark place?
Oh, yes. Yes. I think one really important thing to say of that dark place, and it really was dark. I did one thing right. The one thing I think I did well was I told people. I told my wife. I told my best friends. And that allowed them, and then from there, I give all credit to my wife and my good friends. They walked with me through that. And one of the great things that they did during that time, and this is what a good friend does, is they see an alternate future that you can't see. I mean, I thought my life was devolving. I was going to end up in an insane asylum or worse. I mean, I really did. I was very scared. And my wife and my friends said that, no, we're not going to let you get there. We're walking with you through this. And they believed in my future in a way that I couldn't. And that was incredibly powerful. And by the way, Dr. Meg, they were the ones who sort of said, hey, Justin, we need to put a governor on your life because you're just in this chaotic, do everything at the law firm, work late, answer your phone anytime, live as if life has no boundaries. And of course, when a human lives like that, they start to do what a car speeding constantly without filling up for gas does. And that is, it dies. It starts to break down. It starts to rumble and rattle. And they said, we need to put some governing limits on your life. And I sat down with my 2 best friends and showed them a program of daily and weekly habits that my wife and I had come up with just to try to rein in my chaos a little bit. And this was a total experiment. I mean, I tried medication, I tried counseling. As it turns out, my 2 best friends keeping me accountable to a small set of habits that my wife and I had developed changed everything. And that's when I started to realize, whoa, habits in community, habits in friendship, habits in the family, they're the make or break thing of parenting, a family, of life. And so, I do silly things like make sure I read before I look at my phone every day, or, I turn my phone off for an hour every day. I try to have an hour of conversation with friends every week. They're just little rhythms that I've been doing for years now, but they change everything.
They do. So what were 3 of the habits that you changed that made a huge difference in your life?
Well, I'll start with one enormous change for me was turning my phone off for an hour each day. I started doing this in my, I think, 2nd or 3rd year of lawyering. And, as a lawyer, you think the world's going to fall apart if you're not available on the phone. As it turns out, you're not a heart surgeon on call, and it's okay to not answer calls from 7 to 8 p.m. like circa family dinner. But I had to learn that I was able to disconnect and that I wasn't the most important person in the world. And that really allowed me to be present with my family and just to mentally calm down for a little bit. Another really key habit for me, and this was a family one, was saying there is going to be a day a week where we don't work. And for us, that's Sunday, where we do it as a true Sabbath. We go to church together. We have a family meal together. I'm not on, law firm emails. And again, you might think, oh, the world's not going to carry on without me. And that's kind of exactly the point, though. You need a place in the week where you realize that the world doesn't rest on your shoulders, and it's actually okay to stop.
I mean, that's an enormous burden. Yet God is
Yes.
smart. I mean, to make you have the Sabbath. So you took a day of rest and made everybody. And what else did you do?
Yeah. So if anybody gets really interested in this, they can look at my first book, The Common Rule, and there's 4 daily and 4 weekly practices. I just told you 2 of them. The other weekly practice that became essential was this idea of an hour of meaningful conversation with friends every week. And that was sort of actually the spark that continued to grow into a small fire and then a bonfire of thinking, I need to write about friendship just in and of itself, because if relationship is as important as we just said it is, that it sort of makes or break your life spiritually and physically, then, anything else that is that important, you have to do all the time. I mean, you have to survive, you need to eat all the time, you need to sleep all the time. To spiritually thrive, you need to be like practicing slowness or meditating, having these habits. But friendship has a wildly outsized impact on the rest of your life. About 1 hour a week changes everything about the rest of your week. Even an hour every other week just completely changes the shade of life. And I think that relational rhythm that I sort of stumbled into, because at the time I was in crisis, I needed friends just to talk to and process with. I started to realize that this was one of the most important things that I did in life. This was like eating. And if I stopped doing it, I was going to die. And so I really encourage people towards that low-hanging fruit of just saying, is there an every other Friday night get together you could do with that couple that you enjoy talking to? Or is there a Wednesday morning coffee you could get with that friend who you connect with? Because when you set a little schedule, a little habit like that, it creates a groove for friendship, and it runs completely counter to the modern current of American life, where you become busier, wealthier people without friends. And so I just think it's a beautiful little space of a habit that creates great things.
And again, it's biblical. I mean, God created us for other people and for Him, and that's the heartbeat of life. And yet, as people, we tend to, and particularly parents with their kids, we focus on all the, what sports and what are your grades and how much time on your phone. And, gee whiz, I got to make X amount of money, and how am I going to pay for this?
Yes.
Now we ignore the central meaning in our life, which is relationships and with family. What makes a good friendship?
What makes a good friendship is really knowing somebody fully and then sticking around with them. And here's why. What you just said, Dr. Med, we were essentially, this is why the book is called what it is, Made for People. So if you read Genesis chapter 2, God makes Adam and then says to him, it's not good that you're alone, which is a really crazy thing for God to say, because God is saying it to him. It would be like being on a date with your spouse and saying, this is so great, except that I'm so lonely. You'd suddenly think, well, why are you lonely?
That way.
But it's striking. It's almost as if God is saying, hey, you can be lonely with me because I made you such that you can't experience who I am until you experience me alongside others. And then Adam gets Eve, right? And so for a moment in Genesis 2, we see this beautiful thing. They were naked and unashamed, which is one way of saying they're fully known to each other, and they're fully known to God, and they're not ashamed of it. To be fully known is what we were made for. And then just a few sentences later in Genesis chapter 3, when sin enters the world, we see fig leaves, that's us hiding from each other, and we see bushes where we hide from God. So this idea of being known becomes really scary. And we live in that world now where we want to hide from each other because we think incorrectly that we'll be safe if we hide. But what is actually true is that we were meant for other people to know us and yet love us anyway. And this is, to sum it up, this is what I would say is one way to explain the gospel of Jesus, in which he uses in John 15. He says, I've called you friends.
Mhm.
And there's no greater love than this, than someone lay down his life for his friends. Jesus is someone who sees our sin and shame, sees our nakedness fully, and yet says, I love you anyway. You want to know how much? To the point of surrendering my life for you. We're vulnerable, and yet I'm fully committed.
Yeah.
And that is what we need in friendship, to be fully known and yet loved anyway. That's a way of, when we do friendship like that, we're actually incarnating the gospel into regular relationship and saying, this is what it feels like to be loved and known by Jesus. And that's why it's so essential for our physical and spiritual thriving.
It is. If you don't have it, I don't know how you survive, because as you said, you can go to a great law school, make a lot of money at a big firm. But if you don't have the core of your life being fed and fueled, it's meaningless. I mean, it's miserable. And I loved what you were just describing. Really describes how important it is to not live with secrets, because, when you're fully exposed to somebody, there aren't any secrets. And that alone, I think, causes you to be more connected to another person. Oh, I could just talk to you forever and ever and ever. Are you still practicing law, or are you just so busy writing books and speaking?
I run my own law practice now.
Oh, good.
And it gives me a little more flexibility to, delegate things and handle. But I love being a lawyer. I really do. It's most of my time. Writing and speaking is in the spare time. But I am, when it comes down to quite a regular person, if you follow me around in life, I do sit at the desk and write in the morning. I do a lot of hanging out on my front porch with friends. But, my life with my 4 boys and wife and lawyering and writing, it happens in Richmond, Virginia. And I love it all.
It's so full. It's so full. I mean, it really is. And we are fortunate. My husband and I have 4 grown kids. We still work together, medical practice. We always have. Now we have grandkids. And I'm very, very grateful, because our kids are still very connected to one another and connected to us, and they come up a lot. And, that alone just keeps you going. And so I think as parents, we have to be very, very careful and very intentional about what we teach our kids and why. My husband and I went to, private colleges out east, and I enjoyed it, but it was back in the day when it wasn't the pressure cooker that it is now. And we made a conscious decision to raise our kids in the Midwest, and in a place where they could grow up outside and be together. And I'm really grateful, because now we have the payoff, and that is that kids are very close. So I think that as parents, we have to check what we're doing with our kids and what we're teaching them. And that's really all about what you're talking about. Because if you are an example of living out these habits in front of your kids, then they'll adopt these habits, and it will really strengthen the entire family.
It's so true. I mean, J.C. Ryle was a 19th century pastor and author, and he has this great quote, to paraphrase, that friends double our joys and halve our sorrows. Oh. So, they make good things better, and they take bad things and make them just not as bad.
Yeah.
And no one, and we know this, no one gets to the end of their life or the peak of their career and says, this was worth sacrificing relationships for. In fact, if you need empirical help, an incredible book and study recently came out. So the longest longitudinal study on happiness ever done, it's been running for 80 years. And it just very clearly, over and over, empirically shows that the thing that makes human beings happy is relationships. Cling to them. And for parents, I would just say the power of setting an example here is incredible, because you can tell this to your kids all you want, just like you can tell your kids to be careful about how much you use your phone. But do you put your phone away? Do you turn it off an hour a day? Do you have friends in your life? Are you creating a pattern where presence busyness is pushed down and presence is pushed up.
Right.
One of the things that I love, Dr. Meg, is when my friends come over, I try to let my boys see. I try, even if my friends are coming over at 9 to talk, let's say, I might let my kids stay up just an extra 20 minutes so they can see us, giving each other a high five and making fun of each other, and they can greet, and say hi to their Uncle Steve or Uncle Matt, and we call them uncles, because I want them to see friendship on display, because more than anything, they're just going to become some strange version of me. And so hopefully that's some version of friendship too, because you said it with your kids. I mean, isn't it? The good life is when we're taking friends and making them like family, and when we're taking family and making them like friends, and all those lines are blurring. That's the good life. That's happiness. An Ivy League education is no guarantee to that.
Right.
So as parents, we need to be encouraging our kids, maybe first and foremost, to really good relationships and let everything else follow.
I hope your book, Made for People, Why We Drift into Loneliness and How to Fight for a Life of Friendship, is just an international bestseller, because it really talks about the heart of our hearts and what makes us tick. And if we don't have that ticking in there, life can be miserable. My guest is Justin Whitmel Earley. Justin, thank you so much for coming. I would love to have you back, and we can just keep talking about your other book, but this is a fabulous read. Thanks so much for coming on.
You're so welcome, and I like that idea. So maybe we'll talk again soon. Thanks, Dr. Meg.